to a special edition of Newsmakers, and it's a big week here at CHCH as Friday marks 70 years since Ken Sobel flipped the switch and put CHCH on the air. And throughout the week here, we'll be looking back with some of our station's biggest personalities and looking ahead to where the future of our station can go. On today's show, we are reflecting on some of the seminal shows that aired on CHCH. We have interviews from people who were there when programs like Hilarious House of Frightenstein, In Session, Comedy Club 54, as well as the pantheon of shows created by Steve Smith and his wife Morg, which of course includes the legendary Red Green. And to help us do that, we have producer Don Jonescu joining us. And Don, you were told to create some content for the 70th anniversary, and you might have went above and beyond that ask there.
Well, it didn't seem like it at the time, Louie. I made a list of people and things that I wanted to pursue, and over the last month, I've looked at the amount of content that I have, and it is way too much.
That's what we're doing here on the show. We're making sure, like, all your hard work, you and Keith have, of course, been working really hard putting this together, bringing people into the building. That's really been a rewarding experience. I know throughout the week we're going to get into some individual stories and things like that. Today we're focusing on some of the shows. But for you personally, what was that like, getting to bring people here, see their reactions to being welcomed back, being kind of re-welcomed into the family, it felt like? And
that was the key word. When I said to everybody from Paul Hendrick to Dan McLean to Mitch Markowitz, I always said, welcome home. And it's true. And it's an expression I've used a lot and other people are using, but we do stand on the shoulders of all of those folks who came before us. And hopefully the next generation will stand on our shoulders. We'll see. I'm a little creaky.
Ty Katz used that line a lot too. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. It's been great seeing some of the personalities. We had Connie and Dan behind the desk a couple of weeks ago. That was a lot of fun. We're going to, of course, hear from them throughout the week. But as mentioned, today's show is focusing on past shows here at CHCH. Who are we going to hear from today?
Well, today we got Mitch Markowitz, the co-creator with his brother Riff of Hilarious House of Frightenstein. Now, on Morning Live, we've had Mitch on a number of times, and he has told the stories, but when we sat down with him a couple weeks ago, I heard stories that blew my mind and had me screaming in my head, Mitch, why am I only hearing about this for the first time? And I think the answer is, of course, he wanted to save it for the 70th.
Yeah, there you go. We also have Triumph guitarist Rick Emmett.
All right, well, that was a bit of a personal thing. When I was researching the shows, I came across In Session, and I saw Burton Cummings, Rick Emmett, Bruce Coburn, Ian Thomas, Stevie Ray Vaughan, B.B. King, all these people, and I thought, Rick Emmett. 12-year-old Don, 13-year-old Don was a huge Triumph fan. Wouldn't it be fun to bring him in to get him to talk about it? Why not? And he did.
Yeah. When he came in, he definitely had that rock star. He still has that rock star presence about him, the aura around him. He still got the hair. Like you had an album that he signed for you, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was their live album, Stages, and it was a compilation of different shows across a tour. And I had it for him to sign, and he signed it. Thanks for being such a fan, Rick Emmett. And then on the cover, there's a crowd scene where the band is in full lights and you can see the heads of people. And he drew an arrow to one head and said, Don's here. And honestly, that was just...
That's awesome. We're also going to hear from homegrown Canadian star, Hamilton's very own SCTV's Dave Thomas.
Yeah, Dave Thomas, we've heard from him before on this podcast, but he had so much to share about CHCH. And in this segment today, we're going to talk about Tiny Town Time and Bill Lawrence, arguably one of the all-time greatest shows CHCH ever put together.
We'll hear from the minds behind Club 54, and we'll hear from Steve Smith as well.
Yeah, that was another one. Okay, I knew about Smith & Smith with his wife, Morag. I knew about Red Green. Everybody knows Red Green. but I didn't know about the 2 shows in between. And it turns out the Gemini we have sitting on our front table is actually from the Comedy Mill, and we talked briefly about that.
Well, let's get started.
All right, well, we're going to start with Mitch Markowitz, and he's telling the story of how Frightenstein came to CHCH. The initial meeting didn't go well, and it didn't look like they were going to make a deal until Mitch's brother Riff came up with the clincher.
Here we go.
What would you say if we could bring in a real big-time Hollywood star? And Sid said, again, like Sid would, he said, like who? And Riff looked up into the sky and like this and was hoping an idea would come down. And he just pulled down like this and said, I don't know, like Vincent Price. And Sid just, his head spun around and said, listen, Randy, if you could get Vincent Price to come to our little station, independent station, in Hamilton, Ontario, I'd sign right now, right here, for 130 hour-long episodes. And Riff goes like this and pulls out a contract and puts it in front of Sid, and he signed it. And that's how it all came to be. Then all we had to do was figure out, how the hell are we going to get Vincent Price?
You're doing a horror show. You think there's only one voice I need, and Vincent Price, of course, legendary through the 60s of that spooky read that he has. This is an incredible story.
It's truly an amazing story. Of all the older actors who were around in 1971, there was, I think, still Boris Karloff and others, but it was Vincent Price. How do you get Vincent Price? Is he not busy? I mean, the Brady Bunch episode isn't for a couple of years yet, so I guess he had some time.
The story is he came down here to CHCH. He came to the studios, Television City down there at Jackson, and shot all those intros in a series of 2 days, I think.
It was basically, yeah, it was 2 days. He was working on a film in Italy, or the example they said was, even if you're working on a film in Italy, Vincent, we'll fly you in, pay you. We'll shoot all your segments in 2 days. But the best part of the story is Mitch says when Vincent Price walked onto the set, he was genuinely a nice person and appreciative of the crew and the efforts and loved the idea of the show.
Now, there were only 130 hours, but people like Mike Myers, Alice Cooper are on record of saying how much that show influenced them.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, those of you who remember Alice Cooper in his heyday before he went on the Muppet Show, he had this whole dark persona that he based around Frightenstein, and we're hoping to have more from Alice Cooper, but if you have time, Louie, Mitch did share a story where he was at a Comic-Con and nobody was really in his line. Then suddenly there were hundreds of people in line, and he asked one person what's going on, and they said, hey, Alice Cooper is upstairs. He told us that he was influenced by the House of Frightenstein, and you're the co-creator, and you're here, so we're all coming down to see you.
That's awesome.
So even today, he still appreciates.
And we have the clip of him talking about that?
Yes.
I think we do, yeah.
Billy came into the office one day because they were doing Party Game at the time, another show Riff did for CHCH, another huge success, played right across Canada, syndicated. And he heard what we were talking about, and he said, let me do it, man. I can do it. And Riff said, Billy, you're already doing Party Game. You're flying every Wednesday down to California to do the Sonny and Cher show. You're doing this, you're doing those the beer commercials. Like, you're a busy cat. You don't have enough in you to do. I can do it, man. Let me do it. And we had to start shooting like a week later. He said, okay, you're in.
And now that was Mitch talking about Billy Van and his insatiable appetite for work.
I mean, the story, another story from Mitch I'd never heard before. He was doing Sonny and Cher at the time, which is a weekly show. He was doing Party Game on CHCH, but he kept walking into the studio saying, I'll do it. They needed somebody in a gorilla costume who could fall over. And the guy they had couldn't do it. So Billy Van said, I can do it. Yeah. And he did it, and they used it over and over and over again.
So you mentioned the Party Game, obviously another huge show. here at CHCH. One that we look back on very fondly is the Red Green Show, and it was originally shot in our old Jackson Street studios.
Yeah, it's amazing. I remember when I first got to CHCH, I walked in and the security guard there, Gord, said as we're walking by the studio, he goes, the Red Green shot there. And I was like, the Red Green Show was shot here? Usually these things you would think are subbed out to somewhere else, but it was right there. So a couple of shows I put together for Christmas over the years, I worked in the same studios as Red Green. I feel pretty good about that.
And Steve Smith, of course, was Red Green, and our very own Matt Ingram. He was a super fan of Red Green growing up, and he sat down with the comedy maestro, share some memories, and what's next.
Red Green character started on Smith & Smith in 1978, and I was making fun of Red Fisher, which was like a straight-out fishing show, and he had the attitude that nothing would bore you, and I thought that was fascinating. He was going to fill the half hour. It was your job to make it interesting, and that's where I went with Red Green. And then we thought, well, let's just expand that into a whole show. I was comfortable. We already had some positive reaction to the character, and I remember going into the station and saying, I need you to give me enough money that I can do something, but not enough that you care what it is. And that was the Red Green Show, and we did everything, small crew, and away we went, and we had fun. I think when you watch the show, you can tell that we're having a good time doing it. It seems that people have somebody in their family that it reminds them of, maybe an uncle or a grandfather. I say to people, if you don't have a Red Green in your family, it's probably you. So people do relate to that, and I think these days you're almost sitting on the edge of your seat when you're watching some of these shows, because you don't know what they're going to say. Is that going to be appropriate?
Right.
People say to me, this is the show I watched with my dad, kind of deal. The whole family would watch together because they knew it was kind of a safe environment. The last 4 years I'm doing a podcast with my son in the Red Green character, and now we're doing an animated version, all brand new material, but an animated version of the show, which will be coming out in the fall. But the show's we got it hooked up with a company in Kansas who's streaming, and we got our own channel now. So
oh, wow.
Yeah, it won't die.
It won't die. I love that. First of all, you brought Steve Smith. This was recent. You brought him in on Friday.
That's right.
He's still that. Like, you look at him, you hear that gravelly voice. Like, you go right back to that show and the hours spent on the couch on Saturday mornings or whenever you watched it. It was a real trip to see him back here.
And then he says things like, it won't die.
Well, an animated series. He's got it's got a whole channel, and you can stream the show. I'm going to steal this from you. Where can you steal it from?
You can get it from Roku, Samsung TV, Pluto TV in Canada airs it.
His YouTube page has it all there too.
Yeah,
every like too. 15 seasons or something like that. We aren't done discussing the show. Of course, a show like that deserves a couple of clips to talk about. And you had the opportunity to speak with another important part of the Red Green Show, who also shared some memories.
Yeah, Patrick McKenna, or as I can call him, Pat. He played Harold Green, producer and nephew of Red Green, and boy, oh boy, you'll see in the clip, if you're watching this, he cannot stop smiling, talking about Red Green, especially the story he shares when the audience got a shock.
All right, let's take a look.
Every night we had so many wonderful, crazy things happen because we never really rehearsed. We would just kind of come in and say the lines in front of the camera so we knew where to stand that night for the live show. So we never really heard the jokes in themselves until that night. We tried not to say the punchlines during rehearsal so we wouldn't kind of ruin the joke for everybody. So that was always the excitement, to hear that first laugh that would just crisp in the room. And I think the one that stands out the most would be the night we dropped a canoe from the ceiling in the middle of a scene at the very large build at the studio that was so no one saw it up there. So as we were speaking, suddenly this canoe just smashed on the ground in front of us, and trying to maintain our position with that while the audience was screaming and yelling in shock and fear and laughter all at the one time was probably the hardest, funniest moment, because it just brought you into that moment. When you're in the characters, so sometimes you miss all the wonderful stuff happening around you, but that smashed us out of it.
Now, you had Steve Smith, who looked exactly like Red Green, no suspenders, no glasses. That did take me a second to clue in. Of course, you knew Harold, but you didn't have the glasses, didn't have the suspenders. A little bit different looking there.
Well, we've all aged, Louie.
Well, let's speak for yourself, Donald.
And I think that having a boat crash from the ceiling in the middle of a show probably contributes to that.
Yeah. That wasn't the only show that Steve Smith created for CHCH.
So again, doing my little research, noodling around on the computer, and I find out that he's done a few other shows. And along with his wife Morag, they did Smith and Smith, which I think was their first show here. It was the two of them, little monologue, a little sketch. It was really, really, really funny. Then they decided to try something else. They brought their kids in to create Me and Max. And then after that only lasted a season, and then the Comedy Mill. And Steve shares a couple quick stories.
All right, let's listen in.
I guess it was like the Canadian Sonny and Cher, you know, and what had happened was my wife and I had been an opening act for Al Martino, an old Italian crooner at Hamilton Place here. And we did a Canadian tour with him, and when we got back, my wife decided we should have a television show. So she got a meeting with Frank DeNardis, who was the general manager at CH, and he'd been at the Al Martino thing.
Oh.
And he enjoyed our performance, and he said, somebody's going to put you on television, it might as well be us, and away we went.
Somebody's going to put you on television. We played some of the intros. We saw some of the intros at the beginning. Him and his wife Morag really were this like 1-2 comedy punch. She mentioned it there. They were sort of the Sonny and Cher of CHCH at the time, for sure.
No, absolutely. It's funny. People remember Smith and Smith, and they love Smith and Smith. But when you say, yeah, boy, and then Red Green, there's always that little bit of a disconnect that they can't quite do. They can't quite make the leap because he was so immersed in that character.
We saw the little Gemini that was sitting on the shelf, which is a relic now because they're no longer Geminis, Canadian Screen Awards. And it was the Comedy Mill that won a Gemini. You mentioned that it wasn't the Red Green show for us. It was Comedy Mill. It
was Comedy Mill, but that show, again, going back and looking at these old shows, absolutely hysterical.
Talking about some of the old shows, one of these shows you can kind of still watch on weekends when the movies don't quite make it to the 11 o'clock news. That show is Comedy Club at 54, which aired in the 90s as stand-up became more and more accessible, and as mentioned, still airs today.
Yeah, it was sort of the Canadian answer to Evening at the Improv, except they didn't want the brick wall that everybody was doing and that you see parodied now. They did it at the actual Club 54 in Burlington. And again, I thought, well, what would Ben Guyatt be doing these days? And he's actually quite busy, but he was able to carve out time along with his partner, Gene, to talk about the genesis of the show and a really, really funny story about Russell Peters, one you wouldn't imagine seeing the career he has now.
All right, let's take a look.
He was very uptight. He was very nervous. His first TV appearance. And so I introduced him on stage, and when we shot the show, I told the comedians in makeup, do 20, 30 minutes tops, but our floor director will give you the wrap it up sign or give you the 5 sign, right? So I'm expecting Russell to do 15, 20 minutes. He goes on stage. I got to use the men's room in the green room. I go into the back. I wasn't even in there 5 minutes, and I hear, well, I think I've had enough of this. And I raced down the corridor, back onto the stage, took the mic, and Russell Peters, everybody, and he left the stage. He did 7 minutes. And what rattled him was his ex-girlfriend was sitting in the front row and just staring at him, giving him the death eye.
We've all had those moments there, Don.
Absolutely. I think during this podcast.
I can attest to that. Yes. It wasn't just him running the show, though.
No, the owner of the club and co-creator of the show, Gene Quantum Mateo, and I practiced that name repeatedly.
Well done.
A great great guy. Just, accommodated Keith and I and told us some great stories. But the clip I wanted to showcase was, we don't always hear about the people behind the camera, and he acknowledges one longtime director at CHCH.
Let's take a look.
Larry Schnurr, who directed the show, he would pan the audience all the time, like from between jokes and between comics and stuff, do close-ups and just general. And people in the audience were going to see themselves on TV. So but back in those days, of course, Ben mentioned it. Comedy was a lot easier.
Comedy at Club 54, of course. We mentioned that. Still airs today. The club is still there. Are they still doing comedy nights?
They sure are.
They're still doing comedy nights?
They sure are.
There's still a discotheque, I think, on weekends now?
It's got a nice mix of things.
That's good. That's
sure,
good. Yeah, down there in Burlington, of course.
Yeah, it's amazing that a club like that has been around for years, 30 years at least, right? Clubs come and go all the time. At least that's what the kids tell me.
You mentioned Larry. Larry had a hand in many of the station's biggest shows.
Yeah, everybody I spoke to mentioned Larry Schnurr, and even the people around here who have been around for a while talked about how he had a hand in creating the entire vibe in the 80s and the 90s of CHCH, and a lot of these things wouldn't have the staying power.
Speaking of the 80s, another big show here on CH, huge show, bringing big artists in to be a part of it, was In Session, and that became, like I said, almost a who's who of rock music. Everyone from the late Stevie Ray Vaughan, B.B. King, Bruce Cockburn, Ian Thomas, Burton Cummings, Coburn, and Triumph's Rick Emmett appeared on the show.
Yeah, again, it was amazing. I'm like, yeah, okay, I knew about Stevie Ray Vaughan and B.B. King, and I'm like, Rick Emmett. And, I said how excited I was. But then Burton Cummings, and he has told us in the past about how nervous he was. But it was absolutely amazing. So how exciting it was for me to have Rick Emmett in the show, who talked about how he was on Once Not Twice, once with Bruce Cockburn, once with Ian Thomas, and there was a definitely different vibe to each.
Let's take a look.
That series that CHCH did, they had, I think Stevie Ray Vaughan did a show, and did they have B.B. King too?
Yes.
Yeah. So there were some big names, and I think when I saw that, whoever it was that was pitching, saying, "Hey, why don't you come to Hamilton and do this thing?" I went, "Okay, I'm in," And I think they said to me too, who would you like to work with? And I said, well, I suppose if I pick a Canadian person, it makes it even better for your CanCon, whatever. And they went, yeah. And I went, well, I've always wanted to, get to know Bruce Cockburn. So that was the first one that I did. And the next time when they came back and said, who would you like to work with this time? I go, how about Ian Thomas? In Ian's case, it was more like he wanted to treat the show like we were going to be a garage band, playing. We played a Kinks tune. Ian sang a Led Zeppelin song. I played slide guitar like Jimmy Page, and so it was so much fun.
Now, we had Burton Cummings. We had you on to talk about your Burton Cummings interview a few months ago, actually, and he brought it up and, being, a part of that show. And he mentioned the story about being super nervous, the day of, in his hotel room, going through in the shower, just singing to make sure he didn't screw it up.
Yeah, that's amazing. You never think that at this stage, or even at that stage, a guy like Burton Cummings or Rick Emmett, they would feel some pressure. I mean, they know their craft. They're playing to arenas, not clubs, arenas full of people. What's the big deal?
So we've been talking about some of the all-time biggest shows here at CHCH. We mentioned a few of them: the House of Frightenstein, Comedy at Club 54, Red Green Show. One of the biggest shows our viewers and listeners may be wondering about, Tiny Talent Time, one of the biggest shows to ever air on CHCH.
Incredible. I always knew that show was huge, but almost every person I spoke to for this project mentions Tiny Talent Time. Either they were on it, they want to be on it, blah, 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 blah. But Rick Emmett shared a very interesting Tiny Talent Time story.
Let's take a look.
There was a girl, she was so pretty, and by about grade 6 or 7, her name was, she had a Lithuanian name, Aglaili Asavikius. I'll never forget it. Aglaili, that's a pretty different kind of first name. But she played on Tiny Talent Time, and it was like she was the celebrity of our school because she'd been on television, right? Now, I have no idea what she went on to, but in the back of my mind, it was like, well, if Aglaili can play on TV, someday I'm going to play on TV too.
So Aglaili, if you are listening, let us know what you're doing today, because Rick Emmett wants to know. If Rick Emmett wants to know what you're doing, we want to know what you're doing.
Absolutely. Again, imagine. My hope is that somewhere it gets back to her, that Rick Emmett still remembers.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was more from Tiny Talent Time.
Memories of people who were viewers but never got on themselves, including someone we've already heard from today, someone who really wanted to be on Tiny Talent Time but never got to do it. Let's take a look and see who that was.
Easily, when I was watching CHCH, it would always be Tiny Talent Time. Would probably be my first memory of that. It was definitely CHCH, because I would see the kids everyone would be talking about if they're going to be on Tiny Talent Time. We only had one guy make it on our street, and he was a hero forever. Played the accordion. And today he's a deep sea diver, so I guess it has something to do with chest opening and closing. So, CH is included in his career.
The jealousy of not being on TV. Like, that was it. Like, we mentioned, like, Rick Emmett mentioned with Aglaili and Patrick McKenna talking about a classmate that was on the show. And, of course, you'd go to school the next day. You'd be the biggest celebrity in the world.
Absolutely. And the other common thread in all of this is that it wasn't just Tiny Talent Time, but it was also its host, Bill Lawrence, who we lost last year. That gentleman is one of the signature faces, I believe, of CHCH over the last 70 years. Everybody knows of him. Everybody raves about him, what a kind and gentle man he was. And it's great. And in fact, we have Dave Thomas of Second City and a few other projects remembering Bill Lawrence.
Let's take a look.
Bill Lawrence, of course, I meant because he lived down the street. And he was a very nice gentleman. He was like Mr. Rogers. He really was. He was like that kind of person.
Yeah, when you hear people talk about Bill Lawrence, you mentioned this last year. Obviously, sadly passed away. It was a huge story for us here. He's really everywhere in this new building. We have murals of the past, and a lot of that, of course, is the Tiny Talent Time, and you can see him on the wall there, and what he meant to the station. It's pretty incredible to think of. Again, little Danny Thomas growing up next door, looking up to this man, and then going on to have the career that he had.
And I think that's Bill Lawrence. I had a chance to meet him a few years ago when CHCH brought back Tiny Talent Time, and he was on the show with the new hosts. And it was really a passing of the baton. He was funny and engaging and 100% supportive. And it was just what a thrill to meet him and to learn still, here we are years later, how much he means to see the CHCH community.
Yeah. Hamilton community, of course, Dave Thomas, a big part of that, and very proud of his roots and all the comedy people who have called Hamilton home. You think of all the great names who have grown up here: Marty Short, Eugene Levy, Dave Thomas, right up there, of course.
Yep. Who, by the way, let's not forget his brother Ian turned out to be a pretty good musician too.
With who? On his own?
Yeah, on his own.
Okay, all right. I don't know. You always throw a bunch of things at me, Don, that I feel like I should know and then I don't know. I'm a few years younger than you. I know we're celebrating 70 here. Yeah. You might have been here for 68 of those 70 years there, bud. But
some days it feels like it, Louie.
This is just the tip of the iceberg of what we're getting into this weekend.
Yeah, it is. And there's a lot of stuff to go through. Tomorrow we're going to focus on what I labeled our legacy employees. They are the employees that I think our viewers have remembered and still to this day frequently ask about. And I was really excited to get Dan McLean and Connie Smith and Alex Reynolds and Fred Anderton and Paul Hendrick, get them all back. Because again, it is an extended family, and we do stand here because of them.
And it is important to know we didn't not choose not to include some people. I will just acknowledge,
sure,
because we've seen it online already. Every time we post somebody, we hear something. Invitations were extended to everybody who has called CHCH home at one point. So at no point did we ignore. At no point did we here personally say we don't want that person. I think it's fair. Everybody who has called CHCH home has received an invite to be a part of this. Absolutely.
And I'm going to flat out name Matt Hayes, the most asked after person here. Matt has respectfully declined, but my hope is, Louie, that after seeing and hearing all this stuff, maybe he has a change of heart. Because viewers and listeners, wouldn't you love to hear from Matt Hayes again? I know he's on the radio, but to have him in the CHCH environs would mean a lot to all of us.
Well put. We're working hard. Obviously, these were big, longer setups. So part of this show is to give you a peek into what they've been up to, their memories of CH. But you were working hard. Our web team's working hard to make sure there's a way we can put up all these interviews in their entirety eventually.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, there was a flurry of emails this morning. What I do want to do is, because every one of these interviews is 20 minutes or longer. The Alex Reynolds interview that aired on Morning Live the other day, and you'll hear clips from tomorrow, was like a good half hour. And he's genuine, and there's a lot of good stuff. So we will tidy up a couple things like camera focusing and things like that. I know it just doesn't happen. But we're going to put them all up, and you won't miss an important word from all of them.
Well, we're looking forward to that. Tomorrow we'll wrap up with some of the faces of CHCH News Past. You mentioned them: Dan McLean, Connie Smith, Fred Anderson, Alex Reynolds, Paul Hendrick, Bob Cowan as well. Bob's coming back on Friday, I heard, right?
He's going to make a cameo. But we had a Annette interview Bob that'll air on Morning Live this Thursday, and then we had Bob interview Annette for a nice little turnaround.
So, of course, we know you tune into CHCH Morning Live every day, but this week especially, you want to be tuning in. And, of course, it's all building up to Friday, in which we celebrate 70th on the day. But, of course, we'll be celebrating all year long here on CHCH. Don, we had fun?
Yeah.
I think we did okay. I'm going to invite you back tomorrow. Is that okay?
Let me check my schedule.
All right, good. I already know the answer. Don, thanks for doing this. Don Jonescu, of course, the 70th anniversary segment. My producer, my thanks to him for doing this today. My thanks to Mike Corsten for directing today's show. My thanks to Katie for production assisting today as well. And thank you for listening, because we could not do the show without your support. And make sure you like and subscribe to CHCH Podcast so you never miss an episode of this show or any of the other great shows we have for you. As mentioned, we will be back tomorrow with a new episode of the special edition of Newsmakers, looking back on 70 years at CHCH. From all of us here at CHCH today, I'm Louie Butko. Have a great day.